Hello and welcome to this new podcast episode. Today I'm talking to Jennifer Hinton. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Anna.
And I've invited you, that was a while ago, but I was reading a lot about post-growth at the time. It's not that I stopped reading about it, but I'm reading other topics now as well, more. So, and you've been writing two books about it. You are doing research on it, although you're calling it differently. And I really wanted to talk to you because I think from a European and also American perspective, you have a lot of ideas about this topic that I'd like to learn more about. So I'm going to have like a completely different question to open. It's always weird. I have to come up with these questions. It just comes up but I looked at your resume on LinkedIn and you've been studying um, on the university that you're at now, and also you've been teaching, and now it's your employer. You
Oh,
seem to
yes.
turn back every time to the same university.
Yeah, that's just a coincidence. I mean, so when I did my master's in sustainability science and environmental studies at Lund University, which is in a small, beautiful town named Lund in south of Sweden. And that master's program was amazing. It was really life-changing. And then after the master's, sort of didn't want to leave. I was looking for opportunities to stay, and I was able to get a summer job teaching on a PhD course there. So that was how those two things are connected. And then, it's just life being funny that brought me back to Lund University now for my current research. So you just never know, right?
That's what I look like. Oh, that's funny how you return, doing all these things in between, and you return.
That was never planned. It just happened.
So, um, okay, so you grew up in the U.S. and so a very capitalist type of world.
Yes.
Um, you study psychology,
Yes.
and then at some point, and I'm interested in that point, do you get really interested in like a different kind of economical world where it is like not for profits business? What happened where?
Okay, so it's a long story, of course, but in a nutshell, yeah, I studied my undergrad in Colorado in the US. Um, One really nice thing about the American university system is it's quite flexible. So I started studying psychology and then I moved to communications, and I ended up actually getting my degree in international relations. And for that, they needed you to focus on a certain part of the world. So I focused on China, and I spent a few years studying the Chinese language and culture and politics and economy. And I had, there was at the time, so this was in the early 2000s, there was this sort of narrative about China about how the economy was growing at double digit rates, like 10%, 12% per year. And all of this economic growth was lifting people out of poverty and just like this Chinese miracle of economic development and social development that comes along with it. So after I graduated, I got a chance to go to China to teach English. And so it was just, I wasn't sure what to do with my life at that point, and was like, oh, I can go be in China for 6 months teaching English and experience this miracle myself and sort of see how it is on the ground. So I went there and I taught English. They put me, it was an agency, placed me in a small village in the countryside. And that was like a huge shift for me because I hadn't been so aware of environmental problems or sustainability issues. But that just put it like front and focus for me because this village um, was, I don't want to say dying from pollution, but it was getting smothered by pollution. So the nearby factories were putting out so much air pollution that even in the countryside, You could look up and the sky would just be orange from the pollution and the particles in the air deflecting the sun. Um, the river that had been the lifeline of this village for generations, by the time I got there, it was covered in, 10 centimeters of foam. All the fish were dead, and the farmers still had to use that water to irrigate their crops. So people were using this very polluted water, breathing very polluted air. People were getting sick. The ecosystems were dying off. At the same time, all of these families were being broken apart because the working people, people of the working age, were leaving to go to cities to find jobs. I would only guess they were living sort of in slum conditions and probably working in sweatshops because they weren't educated. And they would leave their kids back in the village. So I met children who didn't remember their parents really. They knew that their parents were working far away, but they didn't know. So, anyways, the social fabric was getting torn apart. People were getting sick. The environment's dying, and that was just like, oh, I didn't know. I have to do something about this. This isn't progress. This isn't development. This is something dangerous and harmful. So then that led me to do the master's in sustainability in Lund. Um, and that taught me systems thinking. So to think about everything as sort of an interconnected system and how the relationships between our environment and our economy, drive different outcomes for our health and all, just seeing everything as interconnected. But I kept bumping into this tension between the environment and the economy. It was like, we know that we need to stop using so many resources, but we have to have economic growth. And so there was always this sort of, um, yeah, tension or contradiction. And when I finished the master's, I ended up moving to Greece. I met my husband in Lund. He's Greek. And I was living in Athens at the time, right when the economy started falling apart in 2010. And I also bumped into Tim Jackson's book called Prosperity Without Growth. And it was the first time that really I realized the economy doesn't have to keep growing. And wow, that really relieves this whole tension between the environment and the economy. That means that we can have like a healthy, balanced economy that's not constantly growing, not constantly taking more resources and creating more pollution. And so that means we can have a balanced environment and healthier people and all of it. So what do we need? How do we get there? How does the economy have to change? And that's where I started getting involved with a network of activists and researchers online we were just a small group of people who were interested in exploring this question. And one day one of them came to the meeting and was like, I've bumped into something that I think changes everything. And it's this form of business called not-for-profit business. It's nonprofits that operate as businesses or businesses that are like legally not for profit. And that means that they don't constantly have to pursue profit for private owners. Instead, they can just focus on making people and planet healthy. And what if we can imagine an entire market economy of these kinds of businesses? That could be a healthy, sustainable post-growth economy. So then we started developing these ideas, and the rest is history. I've been working on the not-for-profit world model for the last 10 years or so in different aspects of it.
Two things that I think are interesting about what you're sharing now is it feels like, and I was just watching this video of what is this? He's the president of the UN, I believe, right? Video where he was at,
Gutierrez.
sorry?
Gutierrez.
Yes, and he was at the glaciers, watching at the North Pole, not glaciers, the North Pole, the ice melting, to see for himself. And I think the similarity is with you, and I've spoken to a number of people on the podcast that had this um, confrontation with reality, I should say, maybe, right? And but at the same time, I feel how can we um, help to change more people without everybody needs to have this confrontation with reality because not everybody can go to China and see what you've seen, or everybody can go to the North Pole to see the melting. And it shouldn't also not be necessary. We should also feel the same urgency and um, reality by just seeing the stories, what's going on, but somehow we don't, and we need to have like first-hand experience. How do you, that's my first, but how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one because you're right. Like a lot of people's wake up moments happen in the real world. Although I also one thing that gives me hope is that you don't necessarily have to travel very far to bump into the harsh reality of the system, and especially nowadays because the system is sort of collapsing in on itself in a lot of different ways. So I've met a lot of people with interesting stories like I used to be a financier or I used to work at a transnational bank, you know. And then I realized that what we were doing, what we were investing in was actually harming my children's future. And so I just realized, like, you know, it was sort of an aha moment that they had at their everyday job. And I think also living in the Greek economic crisis and seeing the way that that crisis pushed so many people out of their comfort zones made them sort of open and curious about alternatives. Like this system is failing us. It just became so clear to so many people. The system is failing us. What are the alternatives? And so it was fun to be there. I mean, it was awful also to see the pain and suffering that happened. But it was fun to be there because there was so much innovation and creativity and connectivity happening because people still needed to meet their needs. So they were going about that in very different ways. And there was so much solidarity with like community kitchens opening up to help people get food that they wouldn't otherwise get. And community pharmacies to help people get medicines that they couldn't afford from normal pharmacies. So um, I think that's sort of the nature of our times is this system is like a snake. I often say it's a snake eating its own tail. And so more and more of us are going to be pushed out of our comfort zones. And I think that creates an opening that creates these kinds of aha moments without having to travel far and wide. But also, like, do we really want to wait for all of that pain and suffering? I think there's also something to be said about just when you bump into these kinds of ideas that are inspiring for you, we should just be spreading them as far as we can, you know, opening up these discussions with our families, with our friends, creating spaces to have debates in our communities, just holding the space for discussion, whether we have the answers or not, I think can be really powerful. I was just at an event on Saturday, this newly formed hub of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So now there's a Swedish one that's just started this year, and they held a big event on Saturday where they invited me to speak. And just seeing, you know, so many people in the room, I think there were like 120 people who came, um, you know, going on a Saturday in November and choosing to spend their entire day that way about like brainstorming how we can change the system here in Sweden was really inspirational. So
I spoke earlier with Catherine Trebek, one of the founders of the We All community, and so I can reference. I will put the link in the show notes for the conversation. The other thing that I've noticed, and I think you just confirmed it even more to me with what you were just saying, and I see it too when I meet the people who are in the development goals community. Um, we just had elections in the Netherlands last week. And as a number of countries in Europe now have kind of voted for far right or right winged politicians, parties. And I think if you look at it, a lot of people who think between quotes green and looking for a different future, they were disappointed. And like you mentioned, you were in this community of researchers and of this field who think about this post-growth idea or think about different economies. When I look at these results from politics, and also not just in Europe, but also worldwide, isn't it? That's not a right question. um, how do you feel that we can get out of this bubble and make more? I think it's related to the first question, but to make more people aware, so that we are not just in like an echo area and we're just talking to each other and we all agree, yeah, this is wonderful, wonderful, but nothing changes, right? I know it changes, but it feels like it's going so slowly, and the heat is we're just getting warmer and warmer. So, how do you feel that we can make this conversation, like you just mentioned with your family and everything, make it wider?
Yeah, and yeah, it's a very good question, and it's funny because I mean it's also not a coincidence, but this came up on Saturday. We split into smaller groups to talk about. There were, we did this World Cafe thing, and each table had a different topic. And one topic was trying to plan a conference for next year to bring more people around these ideas with the well-being economy in Sweden. Um, and that was at the top of mind for most people at that discussion. How can we bring in more people than just our bubble? Like we're sick of preaching to the convinced. We need to start having these discussions more widely. Um, I have a couple of thoughts about that. For me, uh, having worked on these things for quite a while and having really been out there trying to spread these ideas, I've come to, I mean, my approach has been to go for the low hanging fruit. Because it can be really tempting to try to aim high and like, okay, who are the most entrenched mindsets? Like, who are the people that we really need to change their minds? And I have tried that and I've failed so many times. And I feel like it's a waste of the precious time and energy that we have when there are so many people. And like I said earlier, like an increasing number of people who are sort of on the fringes, who aren't really convinced the system is working for them anymore, but they don't know about any alternatives either.
Hmm.
So that's where I sort of spend most of my energy, and also even within our like environmental movements and social justice movements, workers' rights movements, women's rights movements. There's all of these different social movements that are set up for different uh, causes. Um, I think they can all benefit from talking about at least or entertaining the vision of a different kind of economy. So that's where I also think that these sorts of movements don't necessarily have a concrete economic alternative in mind. And that can sort of amp up the power that they have, because rather than just sort of pushing against things or trying to push for small tweaks in the system, like some new taxes or some new regulations within this very inherently and systemically destructive for-profit economy, um, they could be advocating for an entire transformation that gets to the root causes of their problems. And with this kind of economic model, this is sort of my grand vision for change, right? My dream would be that all of these different social movements that are around the world really can embrace this sort of transformation and come together to push together forward for these kinds of policy changes that we need to push businesses to transform away from for-profit to not-for-profit structures. Because there's got to be both bottom up and top down, but the top down changes aren't going to happen unless we push for them. And so that's the key aspect of social movements. So that's where I also think, like, for me, it's a better investment of my time trying to get this model and these ideas into this existing activist network and to the low hanging fruit rather than go directly for like far right uh, ideologues so then we can come together to not just push for change, that maybe that sounds too aggressive, but to open up the space to entertain these things. Like, I think a lot of people are moving to the far right with their votes, not necessarily because they're all like close-minded racists or anything, but there's a concrete set of suggestions there that's being offered. And what we've been trying with like tweaks and taxes and regulations for the last few decades has not been working. So they're giving up on that tactic, and it makes sense. So they're going to something that seems quite different and concrete. So we can counter that far right movement by offering also something that's quite transformative, deeply transformative, and concrete as well. But in a better direction, I would argue, because it's actually based on social justice rather than fear and what tends to be quite racist and xenophobic.
Well, the smart thing that they do, of course, um, is position circumstances or people as a threat to um, people who are at the bottom or the middle layer and seeing their world slowly being torn apart because they don't have enough income, don't have Social Security, and um, so they respond from fear. And I don't want to. I say they, and we should say we maybe because it's 2.5 million people in the Netherlands who voted for this party. And so what I feel, because, for example, you talk in your book about, or in your video for the We All meeting that you had, you talk about this stabilized economy or maybe even a shrinking economy. And the I think the misunderstanding of most people in general is that a shrinking economy is terrible because it will just lead to loss of jobs, it will lead to loss of money, inflation. So a lot of things that is connected to them when a economy shrinks is that that's bad. That's not what we want. And I I think you're onto something wonderful with the idea of the not-for-profit business that we look as a company owner, as a founder, as a community of people who work there on a way that we have an impact or maybe ecological impact socially is it's the way forward. And at the same time, like you just mentioned, is you've been working on this for 10 years and most of it has been like maybe for me, it feels like a waste of energy because you've been attacking these top people trying to change the system or the top people who have the most impact, and they don't respond because they want to stick to their narrative and also to stick with the things that feel secure for them is that making more money is just good for us as a small group of people. So how do you personally deal with that? How do you keep up with a good energy and focus and mindset to keep going? I know you mentioned that you go for the low-hanging fruit now, but still, I can understand. But if you see the world around you, it's kind of like frustrating that it's not going fast enough. How? Because I feel that that's to make the relationship here.
Yeah, I think we all feel that. I mean, we all understand how um, urgent the situation is. And when I say we all, I'm saying the people who have been pushing for change for environmental protection and social justice and all of these things for so long. And you push so hard, and it just feels like it's not happening fast enough, considering especially the urgency of the situation, and especially when it comes to environmental concerns. Um, the way that I think about it is a couple of things. So one thing is my systems thinking helps me deal with this to some extent because it's easy for us to sort of think that change happens linearly, right? So if it's not already happening at a fast enough pace, then it won't happen. It's like going like this instead of we need it like this, right? But in complex systems like the ones that we live in, change tends to happen in non-linear rates, right? So you end up with more of like an exponential curve. And at the beginning of the curve, it may seem like nothing's happening. And I think we may not be like at the beginning of the curve, but maybe about here. And then after you hit a critical mass, and some people estimate that a tipping point for social change only requires 5% of the population to be on board. Some say 10, but still, that's a minority, right? And once you hit a sort of critical mass, things can tip very quickly, and you end up with a radically different system quite much faster than it seemed like it was going to happen. And that's the point of tipping points, right? So I do believe that we could still have a tipping point, where these changes take off very quickly. I mean, so in the 10 years I've been working on this, it's not that I haven't seen a big change happen. I've actually, and that's part of what gives me hope and keeps me working on it. Now I'm getting approached all the time by more people doing podcasts like you, but also business consultants. I get approached by people who are doing like consulting for circular businesses. I get approached by CEOs of like small startups. I get approached by bigger businesses, policymakers. I was at an EU workshop on new economic models, and this was like invitation only, so they didn't tell us we couldn't talk about it. This was at a very high level in the European Commission. They're entertaining, like, not entertaining, they're talking about what do we need from our economy and why isn't it delivering that for us, and how must we change it? So these conversations are really, the space for them is loosening up very quickly, and they're starting to happen more and more often, not just in these activist circles, but also in the halls of power. So I think there is hope. I don't think it's inevitable, but I think as long as we continue to use our time and energy as wisely as we can to get that low-hanging fruit, and then seek out opportunities where they are to talk to people in positions of power, we can make it happen. And part of what I'm doing right now is working on a book to sort of transmit this in a more understandable narrative for a general audience, because I think that's got to be part of it. Is, having a very concrete and clear narrative about what's going wrong now, what are the root causes, what's the alternative that gets to those root causes and actually would deliver well-being for all of us, even if the economy is smaller, because it means that everything is more distributed. So the people who are at the bottom now would actually have more than what they have in our current system. So, to sort of address those fears, like you mentioned, of people thinking, oh no, but a smaller economy may be good for the environment, but it's going to hurt me. Well, actually, it would be better for most people, because of the wealth and power have accumulated so much to such a crazy extent in so few hands. So we've got to like redistribute that and then have a system that is distributive by design, as Kate Raworth says. So just like transmitting that in a really clear, understandable way. And then the third part of my book is about transformation. So also offering a little bit of a vision about, this might seem impossible to get from here to there, but here's a vision of how that could happen, and sort of building on past examples of like the abolition of slavery, or women getting the right to vote, or the end of apartheid in South Africa. At the beginning of all of those huge societal transformations, it probably seemed impossible. I often think about the people who were trying to end slavery in the US, and they probably felt like the odds were so stacked against them in the beginning. But then, of course, they hit that critical mass. Unfortunately, there was a war, so it's not the best example. There was not a war, though, when women got the right to vote. So maybe that's an even better example to follow. But once, it hit a critical mass that, yeah, this isn't okay. Slavery is not okay. And women are people, and they should have a voice in our politics too. And these ideas catch on, and it just becomes like the new common sense. Then things can change very quickly. So that's also what I'm trying to do, is make this the new common sense.
I was watching this short video where they were interviewing German people. What was it? English? I forgot. And I think it was German. It was German. So they were not allowed to smoke on the bus anymore, and they were abandoned to the upper floor of buses. And they were really was it appalled? What is the name again? What's the right English word?
Appalled, like disgusted?
Yeah,
Yeah.
appalled. It is, yeah, disgusted. With the idea that they couldn't smoke anymore. It's just ridiculous, and they are taking our rights away, our freedom away, right? So, and then if you look at it now and go like, oh my God, it's so different now. I remember the first time I went to the US, it was already in all public buildings, there was no smoking allowed. So when you came in the airport, it was really clean. In the office, people were smoking outside. And when I came back to Amsterdam after 2 months, I go like, oh my God, it smells, it stinks here because people are smoking still in the airport. And I couldn't understand why it's so different. But now you can see how that changed in just, what was it, 20 years or so. It's so normal to not smoke in public buildings. Of course, smokers may see it differently, but still, I think in general, most people are really happy with this idea that we don't smoke in public or in restaurants or in all these places anymore. So yeah, I think that is it. That's important. So, can you say something about your theory or ideas of this not-for-profit business? Because we have like a lot of not-for-profits, I would say. But in general, what you see is that these not-for-profits often stay very small, have difficulty of staying alive because not a lot of money comes in, struggling for resources all the time, getting like funds from the governments every year. They have to get funds again. But why is it different when you have like a not-for-profit business?
Yeah, good question. I mean, one of the reasons we're seeing more and more not-for-profit businesses, and I define, just to make it clear, like I sort of use the language of traditional nonprofits are nonprofit organizations that depend on philanthropy and grants and donations, or sort of more passive income, you could say, to deliver their social benefits. Whereas not-for-profit businesses, you could also say non-profit businesses, it's the same, um, generate most or all of their income through the sale of goods and services. And one of the reasons we're seeing uh, the rise of not-for-profit businesses, well, one is that social entrepreneurs, we've got a whole new generation of social entrepreneurs who want to use business to do good in society. So they end up sort of bumping into, we can do this in a not-for-profit legal framework that then ties our business to a social benefit mission forever. So it can't get taken over by like a venture capitalist from LA or something, you know. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that nonprofits, like you mentioned before, are increasingly moving into the business space because they're so tired of running out of money. And especially we see sort of a parallel with economic crises in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, 2010, those years, a lot of nonprofits started moving into business because their other forms of funding dried up. So they sort of had to. It's like either start doing business or just fade away. And then I've read some really inspirational interviews with some of the managers of these nonprofits who have said, okay, and now that we've made that transition and we are operating as a business, it's just great because we have so much more self-sufficiency and independence to fulfill our mission the way that we want to, the way that we think is best, rather than having to take into consideration our donors or our philanthropists' sort of opinions about how we should do it. We're the ones who are working with these things on the ground, whether it's like helping people who are facing homelessness or whatever it is, you know, we're the ones who know how to do that work. So why should we have to listen to the donors, you know, opinions about that? And now that we're running a business to do this, we can do it the way that we know best. So it can be really liberating for them and empowering.
Did you also see, I understand because you're a researcher, but I can also imagine that you kind of like have like a positive bias to about the ideas that you're looking for. But can you also see not-for-profits or non-profits that didn't succeed in the business way and why?
Yeah, for sure. So there are some examples, definitely. When I was going back into the book that we wrote several years ago called How on Earth, um, I was looking back to sort of see how those examples that we used in the book have fared. And some of them are doing great and they're doing even better than I could have imagined, which was really nice. But a couple of them have either gone out of business. One in particular was I think, an agricultural, like a food producer in Australia. And they had actually gone from not for profit to for profit. And so I was really curious about why. So I contacted them and asked them, oh, it's interesting that you've gone in this direction. What was it? And they said, well, we were really wanting to scale up and we couldn't find we couldn't find investment. The banks didn't want us to give us investment. Larger investors, people with money, didn't want to give us investment as a not-for-profit. So we decided that, I mean, we probably could have found it, but we decided that being a for-profit would just make it so much easier for us to get investment. And that is one of the obstacles that you find around the world with not-for-profit businesses is our system is built on the idea that businesses should be for-profit. They should focus on growth and profitability. And so when a business goes to get a loan from a bank or goes to get money from a venture capitalist or whoever, whatever sort of financing, then the focus is on how are you going to make more money for us and how fast are you going to do it, because you should, if you're going to be successful, you have to get big and profitable as fast as you can. And that's part of the problem, right? That's not something that businesses should have to adapt to. That's actually extremely problematic. So we need to be changing the way finance is structured and the way we think about investment and finance. And that's where some of these top-down policies can come in, where the government and like European Commission, they give seed funding for businesses every year, all the time, and they prioritize for-profit businesses, and they look at these sorts of things when they're deciding which businesses to fund, like how fast are you going to be profitable. So even government funding does that. So this all has to change, and the banking system has to go not-for-profit itself. Not-for-profit banks tend to be much more sympathetic to giving funding to not-for-profit businesses. So as the banking and finance shifts, this is again my idea of how a transformation could happen in a not-for-profit direction, then that should also free up more funding and investment for not-for-profit businesses, so that they don't feel forced to move in a for-profit direction the way that one example has in Australia.
Like a not-for-profit bank?
Yeah, there's lots of them. So one, and again, for-profit and not-for-profit are sort of bigger legal categories, and there's a lot of specific structures within them. Like for-profit can be shareholder-owned companies or family-owned companies. Not-for-profit banks take the form of credit unions often, so it's like a consumer cooperative bank. And they're all over. And even in the US, as capitalist as it is, 1 in 3 Americans is a member of a credit union. So that's huge, right? Those are all not-for-profit banks. There's also a lot of ethical banks, but not all are not-for-profit. Here in Sweden, there's a bank called Ekobanken, or the Eco Bank. And it's sort of a credit union style as well. Yeah, they often tend to take the form of credit unions. They're also state banks, and that's interesting. There's the Bank of South Dakota, I believe, is a state-owned bank in the U.S., and it fared much better through the economic crisis of 2008 than a lot of the other banks that were at the same sort of size and operational stratum. So it's yeah, there is something to be said also about like the stability of not-for-profit banks, because they don't tend to be so speculative and over leveraged in debt. So
Makes sense. I was thinking about the part you mentioned with what you've learned about China, this economic wonder. I'm going back to the conversation, sorry. And what you've encountered in real life in a small village. I think you would encounter the same thing when you go to a huge village. What similarities do you see from the US, the history of the US? Do you see them?
yeah, I think, yeah, you can, and I think that's part of the myth right? Is that so? All of these high income countries today, like the US or European countries, have been through this phase that now low income and middle income countries are going through. So we just have to get all of the countries through that phase, and economic growth is the way to do that. Um, and that sort of sounds quite logical because it's true earlier on in the US there were, workers being exploited and working in sweatshop conditions and high levels of environmental pollution, like the Great Lakes were totally uh, full of chemical pollutions from the factories and all of that. Um, the problem with that narrative is that who's going to be the factory of the world if China moves out of that position? We're running out of countries that have to be stuck in this exploitative position or the exploited position. And that's the problem, is the whole system is based on exploitation. So there's always got to be some loser in the system in order to allow for these gains by other countries. So we have to acknowledge that, and then that forces us to look at post growth and take that seriously. Not to mention the urgency of the climate situation and everything else. We don't have the environmental space for all of the countries to make the same mistakes that were made in the West, in the rich countries. So I think there's a lot to be said for reparations and redistributing the wealth that's been accumulated through exploitation by high income communities, and redistributing that back to the communities that were exploited for that wealth. Um,
That's going to
yeah,
be a difficult task.
that's a very difficult task. I don't see how we can do it otherwise, though. I
Uh,
mean, we have to redistribute the wealth that's accumulated, so that we can use existing resources to the maximum without having keep digging up more minerals, using more energy, creating more pollution in the process. So there's got to be a massive redistribution, and that's one of the conversations we really need to be having. That's not really being had. I mean, another thing that I think of when you talk about like the parallels between China, my experience in China and the US, is one of the things that struck me while I was there was how much the Chinese narrative at that time, but also now, I mean, it's the narrative of the for-profit economy, is about consumption and money are a good proxy for well-being. So the more money we can make, the more we can consume, the more stuff we can buy, the happier and better off we'll be. And of course, there's ancient wisdom that tells us money doesn't make you happy. That's in every tradition. But yet we have a system that tells us that, of course, it does. So I remember telling people there, like, no, my parents sort of lived this American dream. Neither of them have a university education, but they worked really hard to get up to a high place in their companies. They made a lot of money. And all of that money, the bigger houses, the bigger cars, they didn't make us happy. In the end, we still had all of these deep dysfunctions in our family that we would have had at any, income level. Uh, so I was really trying to get that message across to my Chinese students and the friends that I made there. It's like, no, money's not going to make you happy. Consumption doesn't make you happy. And it's definitely not worth tearing apart your communities and ruining the environment. So that's part of it too, right? We have to like debunk these myths.
I was, oh, I'm reading this book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, by Martin Wolf. He's a economic journalist, and he talks about also China a lot in comparison to all the other world nations. Um, and you mentioned like once China is going to this higher level of economic welfare, what other countries? Well, we have India now, and Africa is coming. Um, and I thought about what is a good example in the world of countries who are doing it differently. And I always come back because people ask me, so give me an example of a country who's doing it differently and does work. Well, I can name two for sure, which most people don't think as logical, but Costa Rica and Ghana. Like Costa Rica is I think pretty famous, but they've incorporated the IDGs and the SDGs, so the Inner Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, into their policy, international policy, and everything. Um, and if you read about the books, if you read about inequality, you can see that, like you mentioned, money doesn't make us happy, right? It doesn't make us feel better. And um, Costa Rica is like having like I think what is it, $15,000 per year per inhabitant, while the US is making 65,000, I think on average, was the comparison. But if you look at the state of the welfare and you look at, for example, education, the educational system in Costa Rica is better. People come better from school with more knowledge than people from the US. And also, if you look at the health system, people in the US pay a lot more money for, medicine or treatment compared to Costa Rica because there it's taken care of. So you don't make a lot of money between brackets, between air quotes. But if you look at it from a different way, not obviously the way how much money we make, but you look at it, how people feel, there's a higher well-being in Costa Rica. And that's kind of like, for most people, like feels like contradictory, right? So like you just described it, we we tend to believe companies, organizations, governments has made us like this I would say fairy tale, but I could maybe say horror story, tell us that if we want to feel well, if we want to become better, if we want to be a better person, we need to make more money. That's the thing. You need to work hard and make more money. And the only thing what really happens is that the few wealthy people on top will just get richer, right?
Yeah.
And the supposedly trickle down effect doesn't work.
No.
That's also a myth. That was a good story that they told us. When we do better, they will grow. So, right, if we in the West are growing harder, the people in the Southern Hemisphere will also just become better.
Yeah.
And it's not true. It's not. It's just. It's a terrible story that we believe in today still.
Yeah.
So there was no question. There was just what I felt, what you was sharing.
Yeah, and I mean it's funny because it makes me think of sometimes people I know here in Europe, different parts of Europe, will get a job offer from the US. And the salary that they are presented with is usually way more than they would make for the same job here in Europe. And they're sort of just like, that's amazing. The US is still like this place of prosperity. And I like have to remind them, yeah, but you're gonna have to pay for your own health care. You're gonna have to pay for a car because there's no public transportation in most parts of the US. And there's all of these added costs. So the salary is still, and I've had a few friends tell me who have gone and sort of done stints in the US and come back to Europe like, actually, it was so much more expensive there that we think we made less money. Like, our salary covered less of our needs in the US than here in Europe, where we have access to, public transport and universal health care and all of these other things. So that's like you said with Costa Rica, it's a really good example of how money and consumption definitely doesn't just equal well-being. It's about how that money is used. And actually, if it's used wisely, then it can create enough. And then people flourish when they have enough, right? Who wants to spend all of their time working? Like, I want to work just enough that I can live a comfortable lifestyle and then have a lot of free time to do all the other things I want to do in life. I don't want to be a slave to my work. So, and I think that's another thing that good examples get right is people have time for themselves, time to take care of themselves, time to take care of loved ones, and time to sort of just be relaxed, be in nature and whatnot. So
But that would be a pro to live in like small communities, small towns, rural areas. Because if you live in a city, the life is already more expensive and you need to work more hours or harder, or however you want to say this, to make enough money to have just a basic foundation. How do you see that? How do you see that? How would because now we're just focusing on just getting these big cities bigger and bigger and bigger. And people, like you just mentioned, in China, people are moving to these cities because that's where the work is, and they end up in these really bad neighborhoods where they just like slums, where they just at the bottom still.
yeah, and I mean that's all again a consequence of the for-profit way of organizing our economies because then that's cheaper, right? You to make if you're a manufacturer or a big company, it's cheaper to have everything in one little city. And then also, like, the successful companies tend to be huge and take over the market share. So then you have just a handful of companies who have set up their headquarters in specific cities, and that's where the jobs are. So everybody has to go to the city whether they want to or not. I actually think a lot of people would like to have stayed in their hometown or, um, yeah, at least, a little bit out of the city. So I think if we can transition to a more not-for-profit economy, it allows for relocalization. And then, that's got to happen alongside making sure that mobility is accessible. So people in rural parts don't feel sort of uh, completely isolated, or they've still got the opportunity to come into the cities whenever they need or want to. So there's got to be strong connectivity there, which again I think should be supported by the state. Universal access to mobility, because I think that's also coming back full circle to the sort of trends we're seeing of people voting further and further right. I think there's been a lot of appeal to people who feel left behind by the current system. And a lot of those people are in rural areas. And, it's understandable that, I mean, they have been left behind to a great extent. So I think having a healthy transformation would involve sort of allowing for the flourishing and the rebuilding of these communities that have been hollowed out by the for-profit economy. So relocalizing production and consumption and allowing people to have more time to themselves to do the stuff that makes life worth living.
So what we need is a lot more founders and startups where people believe that this not-for-profit business idea is a valuable idea. It's important for the future, and at the same time, be in competition with this for-profit market, who probably sell their products at a lower price because they do mass production and have sweatshops where people don't have an earnest income,
Mm-hmm.
and also are probably um, looked at negatively by the current founders, business owners, venture capitalists, people with money, because they are weird. They have weird ideas about what should be right and the normal. So, as a founder of a not-for-profit business, you have to have like really um, strong feelings about it and really grit to sustain in this transition. Because I think, like you mentioned with the slavery part, there's a lot of well, war is not a good example, but I think it may feel like a war with casualties before we get to this point where there is this social kind of world, not a communist, but a social world. Because that's, I think there's also a point that people say, yeah, communism doesn't work either, right? So social, not-for-profit companies don't work because we've seen the problems happen in Russia. Yeah, that's not what we're looking for.
No, and I mean, if I can say something on that note, I mean, I think that that's part of what drew me to work on this model in the first place, is that it offers a concrete alternative to the for-profit economy, i.e., the capitalist economy, right? But also because often people are like, yeah, okay, this for-profit capitalist economy is really messed up, but it's the only thing we've got because the only alternative is Mao and Stalin and these really state-planned economies, right? But a not-for-profit market economy is a totally different animal. It offers us a way out of this dichotomy, and I think that can also be very powerful for breaking up these political silos we've ended up with, because a lot of the time the right leaning side of politics, right, is saying, well, we need freer markets because the state inhibits freedom, and so it just always assumes The market has to be for profit, and the state is there to take away from it, right? And then on the left side, there's always, well, we need more taxes and regulations to constrain the market, but they're also assuming that the market has to be for profit and capitalist. So, saying, no, but we can have a not for profit market economy just takes us off that spectrum altogether. It takes us into a whole different plane of possibilities, which I find very powerful. It's like, yeah, we can still have a vibrant market, but it has to be about meeting needs. It has to be about social benefit, not about making investors rich. And then when we have that kind of market, the state can become a partner rather than this overriding force that has to constrain and interfere and all of the stuff. The market and the not-for-profit market and the state can work together to make sure that everybody's needs are met without destroying the environment and ensuring equality and all the rest of it, social justice. So I think it's this model. That's part of why I'm working on it, is because I find so much hope in it, and also I think it can break us out of these silos in a way.
Interesting. Okay, that's a good point. I didn't see it that way. Um, One of my last questions, I was interested in because I looked at your research that you were doing before in Stockholm. That was EU funded, right? You were looking at the economy system, but it was EU funded. And I kind of went like, huh? Well, the EU is like a organization with for-profit ideas, right? So bigger companies, like you just mentioned, subsidies to companies. Um, uh, why are, if you have an idea, if not, well, you may give your own ideas, but why do you think the EU is doing these fundings of this research when it's actually in like contradiction of how they work at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it also comes back to I mean, there's actually, and they've funded even more projects since then. So that project was called Adapt Econ, and it was explicitly about the limits to growth. And when I saw that the European Commission had funded that limits to growth economy project, I was like, wow, cool, things are changing. Now they've funded like I don't know how many more of those kinds of projects, including a project that even explicitly talked about degrowth. I think a couple of projects that explicitly talk about degrowth. Um, but I think there is a growing acknowledgement, even within, like I said before, the halls of power, not only in Europe but around the world, that this system is failing in very systemic ways. There are deep roots of these problems, and it's not going to be enough to tweak the system. We really have to change it deeply. So they're grappling with this, and they're having these conversations. They're inviting some of us as experts to come and add to these conversations about what needs to be done. That hasn't shown up on the face of things yet. But there are definitely changes, and there's also pressure from uh, I was part of a conference in Amsterdam actually. In I wasn't there in person, unfortunately, in October, called "Transforming Ownership in Times of Overlapping Crises." And it's about how we need to transform ownership in the economy. And we're coming up with a white paper to deliver to the EU to also feed into the conversations that they're having. And the white paper consists of concrete policy recommendations. What does the EU need to do to ensure that we transform ownership in the economy in ways that will address our crises? So I think it's an interesting space to watch. Who knows, how far these conversations will go or how fast, but I think there's a growing acknowledgement. Also, the conference that happened in May, the Beyond Growth in Europe conference. So it's something is shifting.
I'm wondering one thing. I'd like to have your opinion on this. I'm not sure if it was part of your research or if it wasn't, but I'd like to have your opinion on this. Last week, it was, am I saying it right? No, last Saturday, I think it was the day of suppression of women, against women violence, I think it was. So now there's a lot of posts on LinkedIn that I see of how women making a difference, and um, yeah, a lot of talks about a different position for women. I feel that no. How do you feel that women stand on this idea of not-for-profit business and also the economic changes that you have, with also like the political points of views when you see these countries where they have female leaders. What do you see is the impact of that female kind of leadership?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so this is anecdotal evidence, right? But in the many years that I've been going around presenting these ideas, I can say that I have noticed that women tend to be more open to this than men, and especially of older generations. Younger generations across the board tend to be quite open to this idea, which is very interesting. But women in particular tend to be even more open than, I mean, the ones who are like really critical or really skeptical tend to be men. So I think it's interesting, and I think that, I'm not somebody who believes that this is a natural thing that we're born with as sexes, that men are inherently about domination and control, and women are inherently about care and all that. I think we're mostly socialized to be that way. And then that ends up making women more drawn to looking for how can I use the different channels available to me to help care for my community and help take care of my family and all of these things. Um, that said, I mean, I get a lot of men reaching out to me too, like you, who are very concerned about this and also really tapping into the caring core that we all have. So there's something to be said for how women have been socialized to think more about how to care. But I think, it's very easily available to men as well. And I bump into caring and concerned men all the time. So I don't want to like make it siloed again.
Good.
Um,
Nice. Nice. Well, I've made it kind of a silo because since July this year, 2023, I've given like the advantage of women for the podcast. So I try to find every time a woman on a topic, which I think is for me as a male, white male, 55, you have to just put a little bit more effort in it to look for these examples. And that's why I asked. Thank
it's
you.
very much appreciated because we do live in a male-dominated society, and men tend to, relate to other men more easily. I think that's also just a human nature thing. So I experienced that in my PhD, where I saw the men around me who are often younger, even less experienced than me, get access to opportunities that weren't even offered to me by older men who I think saw themselves in these young men around me, and they didn't see themselves in me. So they didn't even consider inviting me to a certain opportunity or not. So I think it's very good that you are trying to, consciously overcome a bias that you might or might not have, but a lot of men do tend to have.
Well, I was referencing to this care part that you just mentioned that probably like 99% of the people have, right? This care part, and it's going against the biases that we have we're looking for similar kind of people, right? So I would be looking for white male like 50 plus or something, right? So or like you mentioned, the goal for the younger man who looks like you when you were younger. And I think if we look for the care part within us to finalize this conversation, I think it's going to be like the start, the ignition of this better world. Because when we care about other people and the world, we automatically are driven to a new economic system. And I think you've given us and you and your colleagues, a great um, opportunity, solution, alternative um, with this not-for-profit business idea. And yeah, with what you just mentioned, with the idea that it's not on the right, it's not on the left, it's just a new road, it's a new opportunity. And I think it connects with a lot of conversations I had lately. So thank you for that, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. This has been really nice.